Hello, and welcome to the Jewish Heretics Podcast. This is the official podcast of the United Jewish People's Order. We are a secular, progressive Canadian Jewish organization that's been around since the 1920s. My name is David Wall. I'm the community's cultural programmer, and I'll be your host today. For this, the 8th episode of our podcast, I had the honor of speaking to celebrated journalist, filmmaker, professor, and activist Avi Lewis. Avi comes from a family of political machers who have helped shape the landscape of the left in Canada and beyond for many decades. He spent years working as host and writer in various broadcast media contexts, including City TV, CBC, and Al Jazeera. His stint as host of one of Canada's premier cultural exports, The New Music, landed him interviews with revered artists like David Bowie and Lou Reed. For 3 years, he was the face of CBC's excellent show Counterspin, an innovative and hard-hitting weekly program dedicated to political debate. He's been an activist and organizer for many years, fighting for causes such as climate change and international human rights. Avi has written and directed wonderful documentary films, and he ran in the last federal Canadian election as a candidate for the NDP in the West Vancouver Sunshine Coast sea-to-sky country riding in British Columbia, where he and his wife, Naomi Klein, live with their son, Toma, and their dog, Smoke. In recent months, Avi has become an important voice on behalf of progressive Jews, acting in solidarity with Palestinians as they suffer under and protest against the genocide being perpetrated by Israel in Gaza. This became an important part of our conversation, but we covered other topics as well, such as his own Jewish upbringing and how it has informed his particular art-loving, compassionate worldview. And full disclosure here, Avi and I have known each other for decades. We attended the same high school and have remained very close ever since. And yes, I sang at his wedding. Here's our conversation. Avi Lewis, hello, how are you today?
Hi, Dave. I'm so happy to do this podcast. I've been listening to the back episodes, and I think what you're doing is lovely.
Oh, that's very nice to hear. If there's a mandate for this podcast, it's pretty loose around here, but if there's a mandate, it is to discover how different Jewish people are expressing their Jewishness in alternative ways. And so I like to start with what I call origin stories. How you got your Jewish superpowers. It's impossible to talk to Avi Lewis. I promise this is the last time I will refer to you in third person. It's impossible to talk to you without talking about lineage. You have what we call in Yiddish yichus, which of course, as you probably know, is yichus, which is, it's lineage literally, but it has a connotation of prestige, a kind of deep lineage. And for example, your grandpa, David Lewis, member of parliament, was involved in starting the NDP. Your father, Stephen, was leader of that party in Ontario. He went on to be Canada's rep at the UN and one of the world's foremost activists in the fight against HIV/AIDS. Your amazing mother, Michelle Landsberg, is one of Canada's most respected journalists and a great hero of feminism, and the list goes on and on. And I have two questions for you related to this. Did you ever feel a kind of burden? Did it feel like a burden or pressure coming from your family to carry on this torch or these torches, as it were, in some high-profile way? And the other question is more Jewish-related. What are some of the specifically Jewish aspects of this legacy? Do you see the Lewises and Landsbergs carrying on Jewish traditions in their politics, and are you part of that?
I mean, in terms of expectations, of course. I mean, there were very strictly delineated legacy benchmarks, we called them in our family, where you had to meet a certain standard of behavior in order to be fed and clothed. No, Dave, there was in the early 70s in Scarborough. Things were pretty loose at my house as a kid. No, I really was blessed with wonderful parents, wonderful upbringing. There was no, I mean, I guess I did grow up in the 70s in Scarborough until I was about 9 years old. And we were the only Jews that we knew. And
Hmm.
that was pretty formative. But I'll just talk about the family expectation part first. I never felt any pressure whatsoever. Mom was a writer, and she was at one point writing 5 columns a week
Oh my God.
while bringing up 3 kids. Dad was often at Queen's Park. He represented Scarborough West in the 70s, from 1971 on. Um, and so from the time I was 4 years old, my dad worked at Queen's Park. So they had jobs. That was what they did. And there wasn't a sense of gravity about our inheritance. I think it's something that the world started to tell me at certain points. But
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm very proud of my inheritance. I think it's funny when I hear, um, I'm a nepo baby technically, right? Because I run for office
Yeah.
now, and I intend to do so again. It took me about 56 years to reach the starting line of the family business on my dad's side, and get involved in politics. And so I bear some of that cultural idiocy of family dynasty,
Right.
which I say is idiocy because on the left we have like an inherited struggle. We have a shared culture of resistance. We don't have power and wealth handed down through the generations. I think dynasty is something that the establishment confers, on its spawn.
Right.
But no, I've never felt any pressure whatsoever. And I went into my mom's business. My career has been in journalism and filmmaking and activism, and I think second wave feminism was, every bit as much the air that we breathed in as kids growing up in that house as democratic socialism. They were infused, they were inseparable, they were pre-intersectional because we didn't have that word yet. Um, and it was just our family culture, as
Right.
as ridiculous and dysfunctional as everybody else's, in a charming and very life affirming way, because I'm lucky to be one of the few people that I know whose parents are still together, um, and still alive. So I'm very proud of the tradition that I come from,
Right.
as much a muckraking activist, journalist, feminist, tradition as a storied, democratic socialist and Bundist tradition. Um,
Yeah. I
and
want to
in a
get
way
into
that,
that. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, that is my Jewish inheritance.
Hmm.
I my grandpa David Lewis, was general secretary of the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, the predecessor to the NDP,
Right.
from 1932 to 1956 or something like that. He was federal leader in the 1970s, and he stood across the floor of the House of Commons from Justin's dad, Pierre Trudeau,
Mm.
in the 1970s, especially the famous Minority Parliament of 1972, after his legendary election campaign, the slogan of which was "Corporate Welfare Bums." So he's known for that moment in his political career probably the most, but he built the CCF along with those storied figures, J.S. Woodsworth, Tommy Douglas, MJ Coldwell, and others. But his father, Moishe Lodge, was a Bundist in a tannery town called Svislodge, which I think would now be in Belarus,
Mm.
but of course in the Pale. And so the Jewish Labor Bund was the political tradition that I inherited, although I didn't know it as such or learn much about it until I was an adult. In terms of my Jewishness, um, that was another thing that the world told me about before I had any particular feelings about it. I mean, we were observant, um, in a Scarborough early 70s kind of way, i.e.,
Well,
we didn't have a Jewish community, we didn't have a religious, affiliation, particularly, or a shul to go to. We were the only Jews we knew, and there was a lot of anti-Semitism. That was how I first discovered, that I was Jewish, in a way that really woke me up. Like, the neighbors beside our house in Scarborough built a fence the entire length of a property to stop their kids from like wandering into the Jewish yard. It was very explicitly anti-Semitic
So
barrier,
interesting. So
a
interesting because,
separation barrier, you might call
yeah.
it.
It's so interesting because myself and a lot of kind of downtowny Jewish people I know
Mhm.
have experienced very little to no actual in-your-face anti-Semitism. That was not my childhood. It's certainly
Yeah,
something I heard about, and it's something that I kind of semi-understood. I didn't get any anti-Semitism until I would visit my aunt who lived in West Virginia. And
right.
even then, it was kind of benign. I wasn't. It was sort of like a curiosity, as if I was some kind of alien, not any hatred and not fear and not certainly not building walls or anything like that. So it's interesting.
Yeah. Oh, it was heavy. I mean, it was heavy. So I went to school for the first time in 1972. I was 5.
Mhm.
I walked through the front door of H.A. Halbert Public School in Scarborough, which is still there and a very different institution today. And there was a swastika carved in the front door of the school, deep
Oh my
into the
goodness!
wood, like a
Wow.
half an inch deep. And it stayed there all year. I think the principal was a nice guy, but there was no such thing as anti-racism policy, or, they didn't know what to do. And the kid who did it, everyone knew who did it, because when it was time to celebrate the holidays, kids were encouraged to make holiday ornaments. And for those kids who didn't identify as normal, i.e. Christian, because it was a very white place, Scarborough in the early 70s,
Hmm.
very white. This kid made swastikas to hang in a mobile over his desk, and we made Magen Davids,
Now, was
and
the
then we were
was the
beaten. My sister and I were beaten and bullied, and into my
my
parents
goodness.
pulled us out of school about halfway through the year because the school wasn't doing anything about it, and it was anti-Semitic bullying
Oh my
and
goodness.
beating. Yeah, so that was on the other side of my Jewish upbringing. We did Shabbat and we observed the high holidays, but my mom was busy recasting her Jewish inheritance as a feminist practice. So I
Right.
remember her changing, all the patriarchs into matriarchs in Hebrew in the prayers,
Right.
and sort of desexistizing all the liturgy. And so I grew up with an understanding of Jewish practice as an interactive, as a creative practice, as something that was living and changing and needed to reflect our values. So that when we said, never again for anyone, or when we had Passover and it was about, even then, when my mom was leading the religious practice in my house, because my dad was not brought up that way,
Hmm.
even in the early 70s, when my mom was still fundamentally a labor Zionist, we understood about Palestine to
I was
some
going to ask.
degree,
I was going
that
to ask. Yeah.
Passover was about there are people who are not free. And I think that was always a part of our, but they became more and more until it's the whole meaning now for
Hmm.
for decades.
Hmm. I was going to ask because another aspect of growing up uh, in a kind of, for want of a better word, politically enlightened home as a Jew in the 70s was that I always ask what the relationship was to Zionism in Israel. My family, we had absolutely none. Not
Mhm.
even, on my father's side, there wasn't even an anti-Zionist attitude. There was nothing. Um, but you were aware of that as a child. You were aware of the persecution of Palestinian people, and that became part of the Jewish identity that you guys had. Is that what you're saying?
I mean, I think much more so in the 80s.
Mm,
I think it was there sort of incipient earlier, but no, the truth is my name is Avi because my mom, Michelle Landsberg, spent her 18th year on a kibbutz and
mm,
fell in love with Hashomer Hatzair, labor Zionism, and the
mm-hmm,
dream of a socialist utopia in the Promised Land.
mm-hmm.
And so I was brought up on many of the myths, and I think for Jews in Canada and the United States, I think the vast majority of us were brought up with some kind of um, some of the foundational Zionist stories.
Yeah,
My bar mitzvah was the first woman rabbi in Toronto at a Reconstructionist synagogue that didn't even have a building, and we had Italian food, which was quite transgressive, and we did it in the backyard.
yeah.
But still, I had Jewish National Fund trees bought in my name planted in Israel. And at the time I was 13 years old, so now we're like 1980, I had no notion that those trees were being planted on the sites of Palestinian villages that had been erased and cleared and ethnically cleansed in the Nakba. And so I think all of us who grew up with the Zionist legends, myths, propaganda, however you want to describe it, and it appears I get more pejorative about it the more the years go on.
Yes.
We're all in a process of decolonizing ourselves.
Exactly.
And of unlearning the foundational stories. And so when I was 18, I thought, I didn't know where I was going with my life. And I imagined that if Israel was attacked again by our enemies, I would go and defend, my state. So
you would join the army and defend Israel.
I remember the feeling, I don't know. I didn't buy a plane ticket or anything, but I had this romantic ideal. And this is how we were imprinted. And I think my mom is such an inspiring figure to me, who over the course of her adult life has done huge amounts of work examining all of the myths and comparing them to the reality of the actions of the state of Israel and of the Israel lobby and of the Zionist right-wing mainstream establishment, which I now consider extremist organizations in Canada, the Council for Israel and Jewish Affairs, and all the other related organizations, B'nai B'rith and et cetera. She has crossed this remarkable arc in her own Jewish story, to the point where she is as broken as we all are at what we consider genocide in Gaza today. And I think this is the nadir of all of that shit that we inherited. We're now seeing all of these stories that are fundamentally supremacist stories. I understand how hard it is for some people to give them up, right?
Well, this is what I was going to say.
Mama was infused with socialism. It was infused with politics. It was, and it takes a long time to realize, oh no, where we want to build our socialist utopia, there are already people there. There's no empty land. There's no crappy land, Pache Selena Robinson. There is there's a society with people and culture and history, and it can't be erased. And now we're seeing the end game, which is the erasure of
but even before October 7th and the genocide in Gaza and everything, I was really touched and inspired by your mom, who, it's sort of an illustration that someone can change. Because I saw her at the IJV conference saying, I am a post-Zionist. And I just imagined what an evolution that is, what a leap that must have been. Very impressive. And I want to get back to Gaza and your activism around that. But I'd like to talk a bit more about your work over the years and go back a little bit. So like many people our age, I'm not going to say what that age is. Let's say that it's old enough to have done lots of stuff. Yeah. You have had an incredibly, I guess I'll say, multifaceted, many-sided personality kind of career trajectory. But even within that paradigm, you are a special case. I think that you've done tons of stuff. Like you worked as a roving reporter for local news. You've quite significantly, you've interviewed famous rock stars all over the world. I don't know if
many of them. I just don't think we talk about that enough. I mean, it's my only reservoir of cool. I mean, I should be mining it ruthlessly.
You've made films. You've brilliantly debated political thinkers and politicians on TV. You mentioned before you've run as a politician yourself in British Columbia, where you live. You've done all of these different things. I've just scratched the surface. You've done all of these incredible things with passion and energy. And my question is, and it's just sort of philosophical, I guess, is there a world where pop culture, pleasure, and art can mix in a productive way with the urgency and seriousness of political change? So is there a continuum, a collaboration between the Avi who interviewed Lou Reed and the Avi who co-created the LEAP Manifesto, which was a radical call for action to fight climate change? Does that world exist?
That's an amazing question. I mean, I'll try to answer it personally and not do the easy thing, which is to to theorize.
We can do both.
Well, I feel like, sometimes my brother-in-law, Seth Klein, often says, where are the great songwriters and the great anthems of the climate justice movement? Why don't we have cool music like they did in the 60s? And I think we do. It's maybe a little harder to find because there's just so much music today. But revolutionary movements without art are not going to reach people. And I think I don't want to hear from celebrities about every cause of every era, but I do think that, look at the recent Oscars and that remarkable 1-minute speech by the director of Zone of Interest. I think that these moments when art punctures the world of politics and when politics infuses the world of art they are really significant. And I think without art, we're lost. We're not fully human. And so I feel that politics needs more art in it. I feel like politics has become a cartoonish, buffoonish place where there is no grace. Pierre Trudeau doing a pirouette, it's right. There was something about that era of politics that I grew up in where there was just something a little bit more erudite about it and to everyone's benefit.
Well, somewhere between erudite and goofy. I think that touch
goofy.
Yeah.
He also gave the finger, and people forget that he flipped the bird to striking workers
and said,
on behalf of an employer. So there, I'm not saying that's a proud moment necessarily, but for me, the era in which I was a local news reporter, and then I co-hosted the New Music for a few years. I was working on the show, just doing interviews, and not fronting the show. But that period of my life, I think I was developing a skill set in making television, in video and musical vocabulary, and I was learning to be a good interviewer, but I wasn't 100% in my own skin a lot of the time because I wasn't, every year or so that I was working of the years that I worked at Much Music, which was most of the 90s. I was a local news reporter. My first day in the City TV newsroom was in late 1989.
And wow!
In that first week, the Berlin Wall came down, and they brought computers into the newsroom and put the typewriters under the desks. So I came of age as a media creator at a pivotal moment in world history.
Yeah.
It just kind of freaks me out to think about now. But after a couple of years of being a news reporter, I wandered down the hall to Much Music and started interviewing rock stars. And for those years, I feel like I was pretty awkward on camera a lot of the time. I developed a relationship with the camera as I, introduced the stories that I wrote and did pieces to camera. But it wasn't until I met Naomi Klein, my partner of almost 30 years, and we fell in love, and I was suddenly with someone who was so clear in her purpose. And so she was doing her purpose work all the time. And I had a kind of conflicted relationship about being a TV guy and what I was doing there. I had a super cool job, but it didn't reflect my whole self. And so I got to interview Lou and David Bowie and, my musical heroes. And I spent a lot of time. I had a band in the 90s, as you remember, and a drum kit in my bedroom, so we could practice till all hours. And I was, exploring that part of myself. But it wasn't until I was living with somebody who was just in the pure search for purpose in life, which was fundamentally a political quest and story, that I started to really invest in my TV work. And then I started to bring my politics into the journalism that I was doing. And that's when I started to do, I think, more interesting work, or at least I was fully engaged as all of my parts as a human being.
No, but is there a tendency when one is getting it? It almost sounds like there was a juncture where you kind of got serious. When there's nothing wrong with it, that's great. And certainly that's the sense I get from Naomi. Naomi is serious.
Totally. Yeah.
But is there a tendency? It's almost a cliche to think of that Avi, who is interviewing David Bowie, there's something as more trivial or superfluous, or was it simply you kind of gathering skills that helped you later, or did that infuse your work now? You know what I'm saying? Is
No,
there a blending? Is there a blending of these worlds?
There totally is. It's the same person, and it is the same, the human energy, the movement of the heart and the soul towards a subject, the embrace of a practice, of learning the rhythm of speech and editing, and the arc of a conversation. Right. I learned so much in those years, being in the room with someone who is unspeakably famous and acting normal and having a normal conversation with them is a superpower that I had to learn. I was as nervous as everyone else when I first was in the room with a celebrity, but actually people who ascend to that level of fame are totally bored by everyone calling attention to it all the time. So to have a normal conversation that took their art seriously and invested real thought and care in talking about the art was absolutely. And when I was interviewing politicians later, and when I've interviewed people all over the world for documentaries, when I hosted and produced a show called Fault Lines on Al Jazeera, was some of the most important work to me, where I sort of split the difference in forms. We did half-hour documentaries, and I did one of them a month for a number of years. So very fast production cycle for documentary work, but for TV work, it was a little bit more reflective. And, we'd spend a week or 10 days on the ground in a place. I was in Haiti after the earthquake. I was in Honduras after the coup, in the 2000s. And, I interviewed generals. I interviewed the general who put Manuel Zelaya on the plane and initiated the coup in Honduras. And, I sat in rooms or in fields with peasant farmers, or, on the street with people protesting for justice. And to really give yourself to someone in a conversation and really hear them, that deep listening.
Yeah.
And it involves learning and respect. You have to know what you're talking about in order to start that conversation. And they have to feel seen and heard in order to really speak their truth. And those are things that are transcend politics and art and pop culture. And we're not talking about the trivial here. We're talking about the fundamental, the human. So that is really the thread in different parts of my career. And I was doing that at Much Music, whether, I might have been doing, might have taken Ani DeFranco to the laundromat, because we always needed a shtick for our interviews on New Music. And we were
I remember that.
Putting clothes in the dryer, or I took, garbage to the supermarket to do some grocery shopping, whatever. They were self-consciously silly setups.
Yeah.
But the conversations were real. I spent so much time studying liner notes and listening into the music, trying to think. And as you know, some artists are better than others at talking about their art. And so sometimes the interviewer has to pick up a lot of the slack. So yeah, that's real work. I consider that a real part of my work.
Another really important part of your work, from my perspective, and I was just always so in awe of your work as a debater on Counterspin, which is a show you hosted for 3 years on CBC. There was a debate show, essentially, some current events, some news, and then you would sort of face off against political movers and shakers on the right end of the political spectrum, and everyone knew what your set of opinions were.
Well, that was part of the concept of the show.
That's right.
Full disclosure was the premise.
Which is great. So there wasn't this kind of false, objective thing that so many
Nothing is worse.
Have. Yeah. But a basic idea of the show was the importance of respecting and engaging with ideological and political opponents. There was this kind of almost politeness of interaction. That was kind of one of the ideas of the show, as far as I could see. Like, we respect each other. I remember the last episode of the show, was it Andrew Coyne, and you traded places, and he argued from a left position, you argued from right position. So there was a kind of a little bit like what now would be called in our current obnoxious parlance, the so-called free market of ideas that your
Right.
Ben
Yeah.
Shapiro's talk about, which just
Yeah.
makes me vomit in my mouth.
Thank you.
Do you still feel that this idea of politeness and mutual respect and all that stuff, is this still legitimate? Are there limitations to debating right wingers? For example, if Counterspin were around today, would you be debating defenders of the IDF in a kind of context of mutual respect?
Wow. That's a heavy question because I think there's a number of really important elements to this. So first of all, the notion of civility
Mm-hmm.
in discourse comes from the concept of civilization, which is a fundamentally white supremacist notion that some people, or supremacist anyway,
Yeah,
it's a colonial construct that
yeah.
some people have this essential element of humanity, civilization, and other people are animals. And that is the source in one of its roots of this whole notion of civility.
Yeah.
It's a whiteness idea. It's a construct.
Mm-hmm.
Um, on the other hand, yeah, a respectful exchange of ideas among people of different opinions is something that our culture certainly feels like it's lost. But I just want to, we have to preface that by saying it was not available to everyone, and not all people and not all cultures were equally respected or invited into that genteel circle of exchange.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that's one thing that we just have to say. And I think there's a lot of nostalgia for that. Which I'm not sure I really share. I think that's still available, and people still appreciate their ideas being taken seriously, even though we live in cartoonish political times. And
Mm-hmm.
there's no question that the bombast and the the game changer of social media and the capacity, the inclination of political actors to vent and just pour spleen into the public space it's awful. It's a shitty time for me to decide to go into politics. But I
Yeah.
do believe that people still respond to respectful and thoughtful exchange, and I don't think that should be granted to extremist positions. Myself, you asked about would I have defenders of the Israeli army on a debate show today. It's not something I've thought about specifically. But I did understand in the late 90s, it was the time of Oslo. And it was a very high stakes moment for the conversation about Israel Palestine. And I went into the show in the late 90s already exhausted and sick at heart at the repetition of the talking points and the bludgeoning nature of the conversation, the Israel Palestine conversation. And so for the first year of Counterspin, as a host producer, I just took a stand and I said, we are not going to have Jews and Palestinians debating Middle East peace, as we called it then,
Mm-hmm.
on this show. There's nothing to be gained from that. However, we did do a lot of shows of debates within the Jewish community and debates within the Palestinian community. And we were able to, over the course of that first season, break down the homogenizing that our culture does of those positions, and actually see the debates within Jewish community in the late 90s were incredibly intense. I
Yeah.
think your mom, Nomi Wall, was on one of the
That's
shows.
right. That's right. Oh my goodness. I just
And
remember that.
we had the
Mm.
women in black debating against Zionists, and it was a powerful conversation. And within the Palestinian community too, we had representatives of Palestine House, who were the kind of like establishment Palestinian Authority representatives. We had phenomenal left academics like Atif Kubursi
Mm.
and Jihad Alawiwi, both of whom are still active. And contributing to the debate, and to see the Palestinian perspective and of course there are so many different positions in every single community, but the CBC audience had no clue that there was a spectrum of opinion on the Palestinian side. None of the news reporting ever showed that, and still doesn't. So after a year of doing that, I think we had developed a much more sophisticated space where we could then have Jews and Palestinians, Israelis. We didn't do international guess it's a lot, but there were Israelis as well in the mix in Toronto and in Canada. And once we had established a different basis for debate, they were fascinating debates because you could see how the hardliners, the Zionists actually ended up lining up with the establishment Palestinian, the more conservative Palestinian voices, and you could see the dynamics of who benefited from a conflict and wanted perpetual conflict, and who actually was working for peace. So I think the notion of just debating two really entrenched sides, I don't think that's that interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Especially, I mean, I remember during there was a lot about the bombing of Kosovo, and the conflict there was happening in that period too.
Right.
And we had, Albanians, and we had Serbs and Croatians, from time to time. And within 90 seconds, we're in the 1300s and a battle that, was, and there just didn't seem to be much point in
You're not going to get anywhere. Yeah.
trotting out all of these completely incompatible stories. So I think the question of debate is just sort of one of framing.
Here's another, this relates, if you put on your activist hat for a moment rather than your journalism hat. We talk about in the Jewish community, in the left or even radical Jewish community right now, about the rejection or the embrace of the idea of wide tent politics. Should we be trying to create something, a movement that's at all seductive to people who are on the edge, or Zionists, or people, should we, or, because some of the activism can be seen as alienating, from the river to the sea, Palestine shall be free. When certain...
Seems like a legitimate desire for liberation to me.
Exactly. But, I went
and
to...
words that come from the Likud original
Exactly. Of course. And we can have this conversation. Sorry. Where I'm getting at...
Yeah.
I agree with that. But what I'm getting at, I went to see Norman Finkelstein speak, and he, with enormous chutzpah, spoke to a room. There was some Jews in there, but really it was a room full of members of the Palestinian youth movement. And he said, you shouldn't be saying that chant, because it can be interpreted different ways, and you're going to alienate people. And so the question is, do we go for this kind of wide tent activism, because then maybe that'll actually move the needle and you'll have larger protests and it might affect policy? Or do we say those chants? Do we express our radicalism? So there's a question for you.
Well, from the river to the sea is a good example, because I think for a lot of Jewish people, even though they might have moved a long way away from the Zionist founding myths, as we were talking about earlier, that phrase still triggers something atavistic and fight or flight with the lizard brain. They react to that. I think that chant is really important, because that idea is embedded in Zionism. The Likud charter does say from the river to the sea, there will be only Jewish sovereignty.
Yes.
Or Israeli sovereignty. I can't remember which one. It's an important difference. But so the chutzpah of Zionists to claim that this is an annihilatory expression, it's ridiculous. But at the same time, yes, you've chosen a really good example. I think for me, we're sort of into social movement strategy now. Yes. And I think that's an important place to be. I think in a really healthy, developed movement culture, there will be an ecosystem of different groups, and they play different roles. When Jewish Voice for Peace was founded, I don't think it was explicitly anti-Zionist. That was a conversation that took place over many years in the United States, in that incredible movement that is so powerful and inspiring today.
Yes.
And there are different constellations of groups, where sometimes you have a group that will take a position. Most of the people in it might be pro BDS, let's say, but the group doesn't take an explicitly pro-BDS stand because they want to be open to people who are on that journey, who are tracing that arc through their own lives and story. And you can welcome them into a circle of like-minded people who don't agree on everything, and we have an influence on each other. And that kind of bigger tent, it doesn't have to be the big tent. It can be a medium-sized tent. It could be a 4-person tent. It could be not a pup tent. And I also think there's a danger of ideological purity and of purity testing. And we see it in moments like these, where the most radical voice in the room silences others, and then people leave. But these are contestations that have to happen in movements. And I think the most important thing is that people are debating them. But I think ideally there are different groups that speak to people at different stages in their radicalization. And the most radical groups are creating new political terrain. They're pushing open the Overton window and making ideas that were previously unacceptable within the social constraints of a time acceptable and speakable about, which is incredibly important work. I feel like I've done a lot of that work in maybe in the climate space. And that's, it wasn't when Naomi wrote This Changes Everything that came out in 2014, the notion of identifying the roots of the climate emergency and the logic of capitalism itself was not part of the mainstream climate movement. And the film that I made that went along with that book, This Changes Everything, and a lot of the activism that we did in that time, including the LEAP Manifesto, I think helped expand the political analysis of the climate movement to incorporate a critique of capitalism. Mm-hmm. And that's, so Overton window work is really important, but it's not the only kind of work. So I hope it doesn't feel like I'm dodging the question. No, but I feel like we need spaces where we can argue about these things, because there is no one right answer.
Is it kind of like this? It's like you have multiple organizations within that big tent. You have, if not now, you have Jews Say No to Genocide. You have all these things, and they come from different angles. But there's a kind of Venn diagram, and they all meet and have a circle in the middle that accepts some basic tenets.
Absolutely. Fundamental human rights.
Yeah.
All human life is precious. Let's start with that one.
Yeah, I mean, you can get more specific than that, but yes. So yeah, I think you've perfectly answered it. You can say to Norman Finkelstein, well, that's good for you, and that's good for you in your activism, but we also have this other possibility, which is, whatever slogans we've got. There is only one solution: Intifada revolution.
Right, whatever. Right. Well, I mean, these are great examples because we need massive public education for the mainstream media and the mainstream, political debate to understand that Intifada is not the war on terrorist, cartoon version that the post 9/11 universe created for it, right?
Yeah,
it's a word that has a meaning. Struggle and resistance and revolution are not the preserve only of Islamists. Just like martyr is what someone is called who dies and is killed in a conflict. There's so much racism and stereotyping in the way that those words and those chants and that language is seen. And so I feel like I'm excited that people are forthright about those slogans and are making others feel uncomfortable so that we can learn what they actually mean to the people who are saying them. And there's that's a spectrum of things, right? Not everybody means the same thing when they use the same word. And that's healthy too. But I understand that it's not all comfortable. But this is another thing, Dave, that I think we just need to say, that discomfort and something being uncomfortable and something being unsafe, they're actually different things. Because the weaponization of this notion of Jewish safety is a real problem today. And as someone who's teaching on the campus these days, the idea that, and I was a part of this, moment where Selena Robinson resigned as the Minister of Post-Secondary Education in British Columbia, because she said Palestine was a crappy piece of land in a Zionist webinar.
It's like the only example I can think of where an academic has resigned for saying thing on that side.
100%. This was the first time that someone who expressed a racist view from a Zionist point of view, actually paid a political price for it in memory, in anywhere that I know of.
Yeah.
And so it was a significant moment. But the fact that now there's this huge backlash, the Israel lobby, as Zionist groups are trying to, force the narrative that the government of BC has some kind of anti-Semitism problem, and they're trying to make them take up the IRA definition, the International Holocaust Remembrance Association definition of anti-Semitism, which is very problematic and essentially serves to conflate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, or criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism. And so we're in this battle, and the words really matter. But the notion that Zionist students feel unsafe when they see a Palestinian flag, and therefore complain to the university that they're in an anti-Semitic environment, we have to distinguish for people. It's urgent that being made uncomfortable is part of a democratic society, and being made unsafe. How about having bombs drop on your head and eliminate your entire building and your family, and have starvation used as a weapon of war? That's unsafe. Okay, so let's get these words in perspective.
To further this, what I'm looking at this as sort of teaching moments, because you really are good at articulating arguments and ideas. That's one of your definite Avi Lewis superpowers. So we'll have a little teach-in, if that's okay.
Sure. If I can help, I don't know. Now I feel
think
like
you can.
I'm on the spot.
I think you can, because I've seen you on Instagram, sir. So I'm going to ask a question that's almost rhetorical. It's so obvious what the answer is.
Sure.
But is Israel committing genocide in Gaza? If the answer is yes, how does one argue that this is the case to people who are confused or even outright hostile to the idea?
Right. Well, I would say I don't actually believe in convincing people of something like that.
Okay.
I actually don't think that for a Jewish person who recoils at the word genocide, I mean, now after more than 30,000 people have been killed, a significant proportion of the population starving, obviously they're stopping aid from getting in to feed. Obviously, as they said from day one, that they're no water, no food, no electricity. I mean, the government announced this at every stage that they were doing it. If you're a Jewish person and you still recoil at the use of the word genocide, nothing I say rationally is going to convince you. That's I don't mean to demean it, but that's lizard brain stuff. That's fight or flight stuff. That's the nervous system.
So what about a person who's on the edge or confused or doesn't know or whatever?
I mean, I think, look, the South Africa's case at the International Court of Justice, that 80+ page case, is an unbelievably powerful historical document. And, just go back and read it. Yeah. And if you can read that document and you don't think there's a plausible case of genocide, then we don't have anything to talk about. I'm not writing you off, but we're not going to solve it with words. I think the evidence is so overwhelming at this point. You can also reach for the Geneva Convention and the definition of genocide and compare it to what you see on your screen. And
so much of it is about intent.
It's about intent, and I think that's why the most chilling parts of what's transpired in this endless, grinding, horrific period where genocide is happening all day, every day, all night, every night, months and months and months. We passed 150 consecutive days. It's unbearable. People aren't sleeping still. We're going to the streets. We're doing what we can, but nothing is stopping it. And that the accumulated weight of all of that horror, if that doesn't generate a vocabulary of fundamental respect for human life and the rules of war and the question of genocide, then we're not going to solve it with words. But I do think that whatever word you use, I think people are either incredibly defended against the evidence of their own senses. They're actually they have such powerful stories that are blotting out the images and the reality and the truth of what's happening, and the genocidal statements by government ministers, and the horrific, the mockery of the soldiers, of the intimate apparel of the victims, the all of the things that we've seen, the selfies and the racist telegram channels, if you can excuse and deny and compartmentalize all of that, then you're not ready to leave the story. You're invested and you're dug in on that story, and there is nothing
Yeah,
that will
it's
pry
almost, it
you
would be
out of it.
wasted breath, wasted
Yeah.
energy.
But also these are human moments. Like, people have to pick a side. And that's, to me, that's what's so powerful about this moment, is that Jewish people have reached a fork in the road in our thousands of years long story, where if you subscribe to this relatively recent idea that the state of Israel provides us all with safety, and is an expression of our legitimate aspiration for self-determination, then you have to defend genocide. That's where we've reached. That's the point at which we are, which is why we're seeing so many Jewish people, if they're not ready to go full BDS from the river to the sea, join the vanguard of the street movement, they are questioning their inherited beliefs, and they are starting to wonder how to make sense of this moment. And I think a lot of the pain that we hear in Jewish voices these days is not the weaponized cry bully pain that Selena Robinson cites in her 5-page screed, resigning because her colleagues stabbed her in the back and broke her heart because she was suffering and she was unsafe and they didn't care. I mean, the narcissism of it is deeply disturbing. There's the real pain that's being felt by a lot of Jewish people, I think, is feeling caught between people in their families who are still committed to the fundamental principles of Zionism and the stories of the virtue of the state of Israel, all of those legends that I think are now crumbling and buried under the rubble of Gaza, the most moral defense force in the world, the light unto the nations, etc. But there are still lots of Jews who believe that. And I think I actually believe, and I don't have research, but I believe that the larger part of the Jewish diaspora community is somewhere caught between those Zionist myths and the actual activism against ongoing genocide. And a lot of people are moving in this moment,
Right.
because they can no longer uphold those things that they were taught and that's members of their family still profess, but maybe they're not ready to go all the way to saying genocide from the river to the sea. And so that's why I think it's really important in this moment to have more Jewish conversations about what's going on, not purity tests, but really honest conversations, deep listening. And when you can spare time from activism, which needs to take up most of our time.
So this relates to an amazing thing you said on a recent Instagram post. You said, it's time for Jewish people to step up, quote, not as the chosen people, but people who choose to be one among many, unquote, which strikes me as this stark choice that you're talking about. Can you just speak to that for a second?
Well, I think that Jewish exceptionalism it's just a thing. It's in our culture. We all, I think, unless you were brought up without a strong sense of Jewish identity, Jewish exceptionalism is one of the core elements of Jewish culture that most diaspora Jews grew up with, were inculcated into. And, the friends whose parents watch the credits of every movie to spot the Jewish names. And, did you know she was a Jew? And where does cultural pride reach into exceptionalism? Well, we have this story of being the chosen people. And we always want to say, well, chosen for what though? Because chosen for suffering. Even the elevation of our suffering over everyone else's is an act of exceptionalism.
Yes.
And I think there's a massive burden on the Jewish soul. And actually, where we see our Jewishness in its finest hour is when we join in solidarity with oppressed people everywhere, where we fight the good fight, where we actually see ourselves as part of a multiracial, multi-generational, passionate, fierce, and loving movement for justice. And that's not centering ourselves as Jews. That's finding through our Jewish experience a universal experience of the fight against injustice, and the fight against the imposition of power that defines our world, and in the case of the climate emergency is foreclosing our shared future. So that's like, to me, that notion of chosenness is one of the things that we need to grow out of. Sorry,
That's true.
and this moment, like a moment like this, offers us an opportunity. Because if we don't, I mean, the behavior of people, like, I'm sorry to keep returning to Selena Robinson, but it's very
It's
much in
fresh
my.
in your mind,
I
yes.
mean, it might be because there's a National Post, opinion piece that was in the paper, just now, accusing me and Naomi of stimulating anti-Jewish sentiment on our campus because we
It's
signed
great to
a
be
letter.
famous, eh, Avi? It's great to be famous.
Well, it's delicious to be accused of anti-Semitism, from the Jewish perspective.
Yeah.
They didn't have the decency to mention that in the article, but whatever. It's all around. Selena's resignation has been a pretty big thing out here in BC,
Right.
and her. But like that, the cry bully thing, not a term that I coined, but a term that really resonates with me.
Oh, cry bully.
Weaponize
Yeah.
cry bully.
Yeah.
It's the victim perpetrator.
Yeah.
It's my suffering blots out the world. My suffering, it triumphs over everything else. My suffering is all that I can see. And the fact that you are not stopping everything you're doing and just checking in with me and my suffering when genocide is being committed in my name, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, the exceptionalism leads to this really extreme behavior, this cartoonish narcissism and supremacy of Jewish suffering over all other suffering. And now we're seeing the apotheosis of this, right?
Yeah.
When we're seeing genocide committed in our name, to be talking about our feeling unsafe in our safety of our life here in Canada, I just think it gets to the heart of the matter. And I think that Jews have been, this is where, if we can return to the Jewish Labor Bund, and the notion of here-ness, of Doikheit, that we don't go to our special place in historic Palestine and found our special nation for ourselves, but it is our responsibility as Jews to fight for liberation for all where we live, in the here-ness of our lives, and in the incredible diversity of experiences in whether it's in Poland in the late 19th century, early 20th century in the Pale, or whether it's here in Canada in the 21st century. That strikes, for me, that resonates as a core mission of Jewishness, not the exceptionalism, but the universalism.
Mm. Yeah, I want to sort of build on that and ask you our last question, which I would like to try to, and you just sort of did a little bit, but I would like to try to usher things into, if possible, a kind of realm of positivity. You just talked about, I guess, like tikkun olam work, the making repairing the universe work that we need to do as Jews and as people. Do you have hope in relation to not only Gaza, but Palestinian liberation in general, and some kind of peace and justice in the Middle East? And if you do, where do you derive it from?
It's so hard in the midst of what's happening, to think about the future. And so it's a tall order, that question right now, historically, because when something horrific is happening, and there is nothing on earth more horrific than what Israel is doing in Gaza right now, today, this second, people are dying in 1,000 different inexcusable ways. We have to make it stop. We have to make it stop. We just have to make it stop. That's all that matters in a moment like this. So I find it really hard to project into the future, and I don't know how Palestinians ever forgive this, nor should we even speak about that. As far as I'm concerned, it is unforgivable. But that doesn't mean there's no hope in this moment. And I think that people who have been engaging in street protests, or people who have been engaging in activism of any kind, even clicking and sending petitions or liking things online, I think this moment, for all of its horror, has been an incredible one, because it's a dividing line in history. People are getting on the right side of history, or they're defending their long-held beliefs against the weight of history, or they're opting out and they're just sort of in isolation and confusion and avoidance. But for people who are finding moral clarity in this moment, in these 150 plus days of horror, we're finding each other.
Mm.
I mean, I've been part of forming two new chapters of national groups right at the UBC campus where I work. You know, there's a Independent Jewish Voices UBC, which is forming itself right now, and the Jewish Faculty Network, which is this remarkable organization that was started not that many years ago in the fight against the IRA definition of anti-Semitism in academia. I've met so many people, Palestinians in Vancouver, Jews on Zoom in this national network of Jewish academics, and people in my town where I go shopping. I live in the country, and it's 20 minutes from town, and people in the supermarket, and just like we are finding each other. People whose denial is not strong enough to blot out this horrific thing that's happening are looking each other in the eye, and the gratitude and the outpouring of emotion that we're feeling when we find each other and we can finally have a conversation. I'm teaching this course in climate justice at UBC, and I know that the campus is a place for, it really has to be open when it comes to ideas. And so I'm aware that there may be students in my class that hold Zionist positions that might be at Hillel or whatever. And so I'm careful in my class to say, look, disagree with me. It's part of the debate. This is a place where all opinions are respected, but we can't talk about climate justice on week one of this semester when when the International Court of Justice has said there's a plausible case for genocide going on in Gaza, and we can't talk about climate justice if we don't connect the dots. Mm-hmm. Justice is part of this frame that we've come here to study and to commit to. And there were a number of students, 3 on that first night and 4 or 5 more in the following week, who came to me, many of them with tears in their eyes, saying, thank you for just saying it. Because every day I go to class and my professors are teaching whatever subject and they're just pretending that nothing is happening. And just like the level of emotion from students that I felt just for saying what's happening, for naming what's going on in the world, it's like not that big a stretch, and for coming out of denial and just speaking the evident truth before us, that alone is powerful. I've made deep, new friendships of commitment, and camaraderie, and that are incredibly meaningful to me. I mean, Dave, you're one of my oldest friends. We barely see each other anymore. But if I have time to see a friend, I want to see you. I want to see the people that I miss. I'm not looking for new friends. And yet I have a dozen new people in my life whom I've found through this moment and through shared work. We don't agree on everything, but the coming together has been so powerful. And I think as powerful as the painful coming apart of people, because people are also losing relationships and no longer able to talk. And, I haven't talked to either of my aunts about the subject since October 7th, because we know we're on different sides of this chasm and we love each other and want to preserve the relationship that we have. And so we're just avoiding it. And that's painful in and of itself.
Yes.
Because it surfaces these deep disagreements that go to the roots of who we are in the world. But for those of us who are actually able to connect, it's monumentally important. And I feel like if there's a conversation about the day after, the conversation about the day after is the global moral clarity of people who took to the streets, who came out of whatever position they were in and moved, whether they got all the way to a protest or whether they just got to reading the paper in a different way, whether they made new friends and comrades, but for people who felt the movement of the heart and the soul and the person in this historic time of horror, who felt that thing, the day after is going to be built by us. If we can build the power to move things and to change the global dynamic, we're in a unique position in North America. The rest of the world knows what's happening. sees this as an expression of a colonial genocide, of an, the powers of the world are blessing this and funding it and sending weapons into this machine. And, in South Africa, I was on a Jewish Faculty Network internal kind of education webinar recently, and there's a South African academic who explained to us what I had no idea, that the mobilizations in the streets in South Africa after October 7th, the upwelling, the mass uprising of solidarity with Palestine was bigger than anything that has happened since 1994 when the ANC was elected in South Africa. And that's where the rest of the world is. Right. So we have an invitation from the rest of the world to join the moral clarity that exists on the issue of Palestine. And I think that gives me immense hope, because we are part of a global movement. We just have to find our place and work harder until we're actually building peace instead of stopping war.
Well, that was the positivity I was looking for.
I feel it. it. I mean, we feel all things right now. It's such an intense time.
It really is. Thank you so much, Avi. This was a really great conversation, and always is. And I hope to see you soon.
Listen, Jewish heretics, we got to find each other. And this podcast has been a really meaningful thing for me, to hear so many voices and to learn so much in the richness of a heterodox tradition. It's an awesome thing. And I love the theme music, by the way.
Well, we've come to the end of the show. We'd like to thank you for listening, and we'd like to thank everyone who made our podcast possible, including United Jewish People's Order Executive Director Serena Sarin and our guest, Avi Lewis. This podcast was recorded at Walt Whitman Studios in Toronto. The theme music was composed by Serena Sarin with help from me. I'm David Wall. Until next time, seid gesund.